everybody. I'm Sherry Harrington, and I'm the, for 2 more days, the coordinator of the CERT Feminist Task Force, and I just wanted to welcome everybody, and then we'll get the panelists. We haven't been together since May 15th when we originally recorded the program in real life. So it's great for us to be seeing each other as well as having you all there. And I guess, should we go in alphabetical order the way we've been going, which would mean Emily goes next?
It took me a minute to figure out who would go next, but I guess it's D for Drabinski. It's that kind of time. So hi, I'm Emily Drabinski. I'm the interim chief librarian at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Talking with these three was a highlight of a grim spring, and I'm looking forward to doing so again this afternoon.
Hi, I'm Dalena Hunter. I'm librarian archivist for Los Angeles Communities and Cultures and UCLA Library Special Collections. And I'm just excited to be here in person to have a conversation with you all and my panelists to see a little bit what's changed in our perceptions or perspectives since we recorded this on May 15th.
And I'm Teresa Neely. I am a professor in the College of the University Libraries and Learning Sciences at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be switching over the screen so that we can watch the panel session from the ALA virtual event.
Hey, so hi, I'm Sherry Harrington, and welcome to Herstory through Activism. In honor of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage and the 50th anniversary of the Social Responsibilities Roundtable Feminist Task Force, our three panels today will talk about intersections and relationships between women, libraries, and activism. So as I said, I'm the coordinator of the task force and moderator today. I'm director of Memorial Library at Berry College in Georgia, and I've been involved with Feminist Task Force since 1987. I'd like to thank the CERT leadership for their support, especially April Shepard, incoming Action Council coordinator, who conceived of and organized the program, and thanks also to Brianna Jarnigan, our ALA liaison. I'll give a brief overview of task force history, then we'll move to remarks from each panelist, followed by a discussion among them, and then finally there will be an opportunity for Q&A from the audience. The first ALA group to focus on women's issues, the Feminist Task Force, was founded in 1970 as a task force on the status of women in librarianship. Its focus was the collection and dissemination of information relating to equal opportunity for women in the profession. One of the first actions was a resolution on equal opportunity for women in librarianship adopted by ALA Council in midwinter 1971. And throughout the 70s, the task force pushed relentlessly for ALA to adopt policies and practices that now seem fundamental. Support for pay equity, affirmative action, free childcare at conferences, inclusion of salary ranges in ALA job ads, protection from retribution for reporting sexual harassment, the inclusion of sex as a protected category in the Library Bill of Rights, and the elimination of sexist language in ALA publications. The activist women who led the task force also used it as a training ground to go on to fill influential roles within the organization, including ALA president. The task force fostered ALA women's groups, including in 1976, the creation of COSWAL, the ALA Committee on the Status of Women in Librarianship, groups such as Women Library Workers, the ALA Committee on Pay Equity, LAMA Women Administrators Group, and the ACRL Women's and Gender Studies section all had roots in the task force. The task force also formed alliances with women's presses to get their books into libraries. And from the beginning, children's books were a particular focus. Members were deployed to the exhibits floor to look to see what the children's books publishers were doing. And there was a popular alternative to the Newbery Caldecott Awards, which became known as the Newcott-Calderberry Luncheon. In 2002, the task force initiated what's now called RISE, a feminist book project, to recommend books for young readers with significant feminist content. A recent goal has been for ALA to acknowledge the racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic beliefs and statements of founder Melville Dewey. In 2019, the task force introduced the resolution that resulted in Dewey's the removal of Dewey's name from ALA's prestigious leadership award. Feminist Task Force is now at a critical moment. Where do we go next? We hope you'll be engaged by today's conversation and join us later for a follow-up planning session, for which we'll provide information at the end of the program. Now, let me tell you a little bit about each of the panelists in the order that they'll be speaking. Emily Drabinski is Interim Chief Librarian at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She edits Gender and Sexuality and Information Studies, a book series from Library Juice Press Litwin Books. Dalena Hunter is Librarian Archivist for Los Angeles Communities and Cultures in UCLA Library Special Collections. Her work includes improving representations of marginalized communities in special collections and working and supporting community archiving projects. This is her first ALA presentation. And Teresa Neely, PhD, is Professor of Librarianship and Assessment Librarian at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Dr. Neely has worked in academic research libraries for nearly 30 years. Her most recent publication was In Our Own Voices, Redux, The Faces of Librarianship Today, co-edited with Jorge R. Lopez McKnight. Her current research project, Dismantling Constructs of Whiteness in Higher Education, Narratives of Resistance from the Academy, co-edited with Dr. Margie Montañez, is under contract with Routledge and expected in late 2021. Now on to Emily Drabinski.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm gonna share my screen. We're all getting used to this, aren't we? It's interesting to talk about the future of feminist activism in the context of the present. So we're recording this in May in New York, and I'm in New York City, and it's hard to imagine ever leaving my apartment. But I'm hopeful that the conversations that we'll have today and then again in June at the ALA virtual conference will begin to see our way to a better and brighter future. So I just want to share a few of my thoughts on the intersections of feminist activism in libraries. And Sherry, I appreciate the comments you make about the FTF getting the Dewey Medal renamed. I was part of ALA Council when that came to the floor, and it was such a significant success and calls to mind a lot of the contradictions that I think about when I think about libraries and feminist work. So I pulled a picture of some librarians. This is a sort of stereotype of libraries. When I tell people I work at the library, I think they often picture this. And in fact, when I was first in the career, I used to dress in a kind of a librarian drag that looked a little like this, right? With the high collar and the big skirt and the sort of curled hair like this, that librarianship is a sort of site of female employment and feminine work. And I think that is significant, right? That even though the leadership of libraries has too often been male, right? We are feminist. We are woman dominant. We are woman. I forget what the phrase people use. Maybe someone can remind me. But there are a lot of women in the field, but we tend to be led by men who are paid a lot of money to tell women what to do. But it is a site of lots and lots of women, and I think a lot of us chose the profession because of that, right? As from my own perspective as a lesbian librarian, that was a big part of my attraction to the field, is that I knew that I would be around a lot of people like me. So speaking of like me, that like me is also racialized, right? That the libraries are racialized spaces and they are overwhelmingly white. So this is a table from the most recent demographic survey of 2010 that I was able to find. We're looking at 6,160 African-American identified librarians in a field with 104,000 white people. So it is a white field. It is a feminine field. Those two things together, and I think we always have to think of those two things together. And I know that for lots of people in the field, that's a given, but I think it's still something that particularly white librarians and white library leadership needs to think about, the ways that we can think these identity categories together. Libraries are institutions that reproduce social inequality. right? That is something that we do as institutions. And we are also institutions produced by social inequalities, right? So we both reflect and reproduce white supremacy and patriarchy in the ways that we work. So I'm looking at the clock and we have almost no time. And part of what's sad about this slide is that those numbers haven't changed. That over decades of work to diversify the profession, to make space in the profession for women of color, for Black women, the numbers are intractable. So the sort of white dominance of the field is an intractable problem. So why bother, right? And as we record this late on a Friday in the middle of a global health pandemic, it's like, why bother is something that I'm really asking myself a lot. But I think this is why we bother, that libraries are also sites of struggle, right? That because they bring together women, because they bring together women of color, and the numbers for library staff who are not in the professional ranks, but there actually are a lot of women of color, at least in my library, often working in the lower paid parts of the field, right? That's actually a site where we could struggle together to make a sort of a better world possible. So I am in my role now as the interim chief librarian at my library, struggling with demands, and I think we are all struggling with demands to go back to work, to reopen up. And what I'm finding is that a lot of the conversations are about putting the women of color who work in our libraries at the front lines, while the white women get to sort of stay behind and manage from home, while our frontline workers sort of take the brunt of the risk in this moment. And it's hard to think about and hard to grapple with, but I think it's the kind of thing that shows us exactly what libraries could do. We could take that problem, and in the sort of time that in struggling to solve it, struggling to produce equity among these two groups of library workers, paraprofessionals and professionals, white women, women of color, women and men, if we can struggle through the kinds of divisions and produce libraries that are more equitable, I think we could go a long way towards producing equity in the broader world. So it's a sort of analytic claim that I'll make. I'd like to stop there and give everyone else, my co-panelists, a chance to present, but I look forward to the conversation very much. So I'll turn it over to Dalena. Is it you? I think you're going next.
My name is Dalena Hunter, and I'm the second presenter, and I am going to present from the perspective of African American Black women's activism in libraries. So this presentation will discuss the role Black women played in library activism by focusing on two women in Los Angeles. Miriam Matthews and Mamie Clayton were both part of the Great Migration of Black people who left Southern states looking for increased economic opportunity and social freedom. Both women were raised in families that placed a premium on education, and they both regarded their work as part of a larger calling. Both women were dedicated to improving preservation of and access to materials that documented Black history and culture, but they approached the task from different perspectives. And as we can see here, Miriam Matthews worked for the Los Angeles Public Library as a librarian. She received an MLIS degree or an MLS degree in the 40s, I believe it was. She was a branch manager, and then she was a regional manager. And so she had access to resources that allowed her to prioritize certain African American initiatives, not only in the library, but also civically. And Mamie Clayton worked for libraries. She received her her MLS through a correspondence course a bit later in her career. And she worked as a staff in library, and so she did not have access to the same type of resources to promote collection development or events and so forth that Miriam Matthews had. So Miriam Matthews was from a middle-class Black family, and was active in elite social circles in Los Angeles. She was heavily involved in Golden State Mutual Life Insurance Company community service initiatives and the California Library Association Committee on Intellectual Freedom. She leveraged her position as a librarian in Los Angeles Public Library to establish Negro History Week events and to collect photographs, art, and sculpture by Black artists. Her legacy is preserved in UCLA Library Special Collections and the Los Angeles Library. So she received a number of awards and lots of recognition during her life from the city, from California Library Association, just from a number of different entities. And also posthumously, she received a lot of recognition. Mamie Clayton was also raised to understand the importance of Black history and the value of education. Her parents took her to hear Mary McLeod Bethune speak when she was 13, and that experience marked her life as an advocate for Black history. Ms. Clayton divorced her husband when he complained of her working too much and continued to collect books, films, film posters, and other materials documenting Black history. She established the Western States Black Research and Education Center, which became the basis for the Mamie A. Clayton Library and Museum. She donated some of her collection to the Center for African American Studies at UCLA when it was founded in 1969. And Mamie Clayton's, right before she passed away, she established a deal with the city of Culver City in Southern California to rent a space for something like $1 a month or $1 a year, or some price, so that there would be a space not only to display the materials, but also to have events. There were spaces to preserve the materials, and a lot of work went into making the space a viable space, but she passed away almost as soon as she announced this development with Culver City, and her oldest son took over and he was doing the work, but then he passed away, and then the youngest son took over, and he was, by that time, things had changed in the city, and the Mamie Clayton Library and Museum is no longer viable. And so it's in storage, and it's a great collection, but they were just never able to get the kind of buy-in that would allow them to remain viable for a long period of time, unlike with Miriam Matthews, whose collections are preserved by well-established repositories in this city. Okay, so Matthews and Clayton were part of a larger movement of Black librarians and library workers who worked hard to document and preserve African-American contributions to Los Angeles, California, and the US as a whole. Matthews leveraged her social and professional contacts to bring public recognition to Black history, while Clayton was known to dumpster dive and attend yard sales to build her collection. Miriam Matthews is included in a number of works documenting Black librarians, while Mamie Clayton is locally known and her eponymous collection is no longer viable. I used Miriam Matthews and Mamie Clayton to highlight how Black women in libraries approached activism in the profession. Both women used race and gender issues to bring attention to inequities in librarianship and access to information. They operated within Black communities and their family and religious spheres to advocate for equal access to materials and for equal consideration as professional women. Their approach differs from white feminist activism that did not often consider the effects racism and classism had on collection development, access to books, and professional opportunities. I hope this presentation encourages current and future librarians and library employees to engage diverse communities when developing advocacy initiatives. It may be the case that good intentions fail to consider that the material realities of marginalized communities most in need of information and services. These are my references, which will be included in the recording. And this is me. Thank you.
Okay, I think you're muted, Teresa.
Sorry. My presentation is The Doubling of Oppression, Sexism, and Racism in LIS. This quote from Mary Church Terrell, an African-American activist who championed racial equality and women's suffrage, gets straight to the heart of the stark but complex differences in women activists. These are just a few of the women of African descent, educators, artists, and activists in the pursuit of emancipation from chattel slavery, women's suffrage, social justice, women's rights, including sexism, racism, and violence and civil rights throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in the United States. The Combahee River Collective was a radical Black feminist organization founded in Boston in 1974 by Black feminists and Black lesbians. The collective was formed as a radical alternative to the National Black Feminist Organization, which had formed in response to what Black feminists believed was a failure of white feminist organizations to adequately respond to racism in the United States. However, the identification of racism alone as a phenomenon in the lives of Black women was, for the collective, politically insufficient as an analysis or as a plan of action. The inability or unwillingness of most white feminist organizations to fully engage with anti-racist issues affecting Black women paved the way for organizations like the collective and the NBFO, and new ways of knowing and understanding the Black feminists. For example, the term womanism is a social theory based on the history and everyday experiences of women of color, especially Black women. The term was first used by Alice Walker in 1979 and later in 1984. This impetus was also driven by a distinct lack of support from Black men, particularly in the Black liberation movement, which was dominated by Black men. For example, it was not unusual for Black male organizers to oppose abortion rights for Black women on the basis that abortion was genocide for Black people. Thus, alienated and white feminist organizations, marginalized by Black men and Black liberation efforts and other radical Black feminist groups, the collective created what Taylor calls entry points for Black women to engage in politics. And in this context, the women of the Combahee were not only making a political statement or political intervention into the feminist movement, but by doing so, they were also creating new entry points into activism for Black and brown women who would have otherwise been ignored. The collective didn't coin the term intersectionality. Kimberly Crenshaw named it first in 1989, but it did articulate the analysis that animates the meaning of intersectionality, the idea that multiple oppression reinforces each other to create new categories of suffering. For example, we've all seen diversity publications and news reports using the term women and people of color as a catch-all for federally designated underrepresented groups. However, adding women to this group conflates the positionality of white women who, as Emily has already noted, are the dominating graphic in our profession, or demographic in our profession. Women of color know, and the Black women of the collective knew, that they did not see themselves in either group because they belong to both groups, which basically means they don't belong at all and they don't actually exist. There is no place for them in that narrative, which means every time someone drinks the Kool-Aid and lumps all women into the protected category, essentially you take women who look like me out of the equation. And that is a violent act in and of itself. Quite similar to the colorblind theory that so many white people think is the key to understanding and is a valuable contribution to the dialogue around race in this country. It is not. It is another way that globally women and women of color in particular are silenced and violently removed from conversations and situations where their voices should be amplified. Black and brown women do not experience this world in the same way. We are not viewed or treated as being the same. And in the context of our street race, which is what people in this country think you are based on how you look or how you present on the street, it could be your skin tone, your color, your Africanized features, natural hair. This concept basically becomes another system of oppression on top of the multiple intersecting and interlocking systems of oppression that women of color face across the board. The profession of librarianship has moved so far to the left in liberal discussions of diversity and race issues that the dialogue is basically watered down and has no teeth. I have no beef with defining diversity broadly. However, it is problematic when we can't even talk about race in our profession without including other non-race related groups in the conversation. My very presence as a Black woman in my profession immediately sets me at odds with my own agency as a tenured full professor, senior faculty member in my college. None of those accomplishments gives me the agency to act independently and to make decisions by my own free choices like my white colleagues seem to be able to do. Because my day-to-day world is governed by the white dominant agenda handed down by the white university presidents with predominantly white leaderships and administration, and upheld and perpetuated, perhaps unknowingly, by my white faculty colleagues and white deans and directors and departments and colleges across universities. Black women in librarianship have been activists and trusted allies on the same rights issues as the women mentioned earlier in this presentation, in addition to advocating for their communities, their colleagues, their friends and family, and themselves in a profession that is overwhelmingly white and female. Evidence of this particular claim can be found in the contributions of these women to the profession of librarianship. This is just a few of these Black female librarians who are and remain at their very core activist librarians, because in the world we live in and the profession they joined, advanced and made strides for librarians like me, they had to. This is only a handful of the passionate and gifted librarians who have blazed trails in the development of Black librarianship. Let us not forget the challenges they faced that contributed to changing the profession in a number of ways over the past few decades. There is still much work to be done, but it is intoxicating to be in the company and following the footsteps of these amazing women. These are my references, and that's my funny picture. Thank you for the opportunity to develop and articulate and amplify the voices of Black women in my profession.
Sherry, you're muted.
But okay, am I unmuted now? Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So before we heard each other's presentations, we had identified 3 questions, and I think we have about 10 minutes for the panelists to talk about those questions or to kind of expand on how those questions connect up maybe to what you heard in each other's presentations. I'm just gonna sit back and let you guys, I don't think we need to raise hands and things like that. I think you guys, we've talked enough that I think you can go from there if somebody wants to maybe get started with number 1 about whether you do or don't consider yourself a feminist and why or why yes or why not.
I can go first. I feel as a, it's interesting, like after listening to the presentations from Dalena and Teresa, it's difficult to sort of, when we look at feminist librarianship and the history of the feminist task force, it's without sort of grappling with the racial dynamics involved in that kind of organizing and activist work, it feels to me like a difficult label to take on. Not that I wouldn't call myself a feminist, but it isn't a primary identity for me, largely because I feel it is sort of marked by the sort of failure to reckon with the whiteness attached to that label, particularly in the librarian field. I think in different contexts in my life, feminist feels like something I'm more eager to embrace. That would be an initial observation. I'd like to hear from Teresa and Dalena.
Yeah, I consider myself a feminist, and like you, Emily, it isn't necessarily the most salient part of my identity. The most salient parts of my identity are being a Black lesbian woman. However, I find that the term feminist and feminism in general is a very useful frame and tool and set of ideals and practices that help me navigate my different spheres, the different spheres that I'm in. it's something that people understand. It's a point, it's a point of departure. Because I speak to people who say they don't identify as feminist, and it's because of the racism and the classism and the transphobia and a number of these things that feminists and feminism perpetuates. But at the same time, I think that there's still a lot of strength and power in that term and in the word and in the people who identify with it. And so I don't feel comfortable distancing myself from it. I think we need to strengthen it by adding, making sure that we're including all of these people in feminist and not weakening it by moving away from it.
I love that idea of it as a point of departure.
Yeah, I don't know if I like that idea. I think the older I get, the more I learn, and as I progress and navigate through higher education, librarianship, life in general, my whole life and everything about me is Black. And so feminists, the concept, the movement, were not created for people who look like me. Just like higher education was not created for people who look like me. They just messed up and let us get PhDs and get tenure. So, but I don't think, I'm gonna have to give it some thought, but if something is created and it does not have me or everything that is important to me in mind, which for me is being a Black woman. It has nothing to do with who I would want to partner with. It's just when you see me, you cannot deny that is a Black woman. And so those ideals just do not fit me. I don't even know if I find myself completely in the world of womanists or other Black radical feminist groups. I'm not sure, but I don't feel a connection to this one in the same way that you guys do.
Well, let's shift a little bit maybe, because I think you're starting to talk about what our next most urgent issue for activist librarianship is. And so maybe shift to talk about what you think that urgent issue should be for all of us, not just Feminist Task Force, but all of us who want to define ourselves as activist librarians.
I'm not even sure I ever, go ahead.
I mean, I wonder who, I just wonder, I'd be interested in how that answers that question is different today than it was like 3 months ago. I think 3 months ago, I would have said something much milder than I think now, like right now, as I see the pandemic, like literally murder people, poor people, Black people, people of color, working class people in the city of New York, 20,000 of them dead. It's like the most urgent issue is like broad, large scale equity that happens like outside of the library. And so for me, it's like, how is the library a site? How can I make it a site for struggling towards racial and economic equity in my city, right? Is the battle over like curbside pickup in a pandemic the space where we're gonna sort of, our work could yield large scale change? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you mentioned the pandemic and the people who are most affected by COVID right now being low income communities of color, but also a lot of these service industries in these feminized fields, right? Of which librarianship is one. So I think that's a very interesting question. I work at in a university library, and so I don't come in contact with the public like I would if I were at a public library. But there are still a lot of students in there, a lot of people needing help, and so yes, I think. However, I think the most urgent issue for activist librarianship is to completely like pull the rug from under the idea that librarians and libraries are these neutral spaces that can equitably dispense information and materials and services and whatnot. I think that many of the issues that we're dealing with when it comes to racism, when it comes to sexism, when it comes to, whatever it is is acknowledging that we're part of this system which treats people more or less privileged based on whatever racial category that you're in, whether that's your, as Teresa said, street race, or what your actual race is. I just think it's so important for us to recognize that we can't hide in our librarian bubble and say, oh, you know, we have these great ideals and we're not racist. Like, no, we need to acknowledge that. We need to acknowledge our privileges and move from that space.
You know, I don't know if I ever actually saw myself as an activist, but in the midst of this pandemic, Black people are still being murdered by the police. And so every time I see a murder play out on CNN or other news channels, that is a primary urgent issue for me. And what has been an urgent issue since, you know, long before Trayvon Martin. And so it's very difficult for me to separate myself as a Black woman from the librarian. It's just one big pot. I can't parse it out like that. So the urgent issue for me is that, okay, I'll give you an example. When every time someone was being killed or gunned down, it was being played over and over on the street, me, the only African-American librarian in my college, Native librarians, and we had 3 at the time, Native librarians, and we didn't have any Hispanic at the time, and now we have 1. But, you know, we had 1, it was a guy, and it's like, we would be in our offices and all this stuff would be happening, and of course you're gonna watch it on the news. And then you'd have to go to a faculty meeting full of white people who, for them, that's not even an issue. That could have been my nephew, it could be my nieces, it could have been my siblings or whatever. Yeah. I see my family and all those bodies, Black bodies that are being, you know, basically murdered on television. And so for me, would be nice if my white coworkers actually could even empathize, but it's not even something that I think comes across their radar, but it's something I think about all the time, as well as my safety in this city.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, really seriously, unfortunately, we are coming to the end of the time. I wish we had more time to keep having this conversation, but I think we've come to the place where we're going to stop now and revisit some of these questions and conversations in June when people get to come back together and our audience can ask more questions. So Dalena and Emily and Teresa will be back with us for that. So thank you. And it's going to be very early in the morning.
It's not 8 a.m. so that's good, because I thought it was 8 a.m. but it's 9 for me, so that's good.
That's 8 a.m. in Pacific Standard Time.
I'm very sorry.
So are we still recording?
Hi, we're back, right?
Are we back? Are we back live?
We're back live.
This is me, June 29th, yes.
And this is me, an abject humiliation for cutting off Teresa in the middle of such an important and personal and answer. I just can't believe I did that, and I am so sorry.
Actually, you did not. I was just looking at, I don't know why that is happening. I was looking at, I was so deep into the answers and the conversation, and then you said, oh, we're out of time. And I was like, what? It's like I forgot.
Well,
but I was just watching it.
There's a better way to do that. And at least your whole answer got there before it got cut off. But I feel so bad about that. So I think that is that a good place to pick back up? Because that was May 15th. And that issue has changed that has really taken that was just, it was like you were prophesying that that we needed to deal with that issue. All of us, white people, need to deal with that issue. And so I don't know what we have in the Q&A. I don't know what is a good question to pick back up with.
I saw a couple.
We've got one. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. I think the second one has not been answered.
The question that's sitting there, I think, is an interesting one. And Teresa said that you're going to answer this question live.
Well,
do you want to take it?
Well,
away?
I didn't know if that's what that meant. I was going to say we don't have any of those supportive spaces in my library or in any library that I've ever visited. I mean, right now we're working on trying to develop some spaces for reflection, like interfaith, for people to reflect or pray or whatever, because all of us walk through our libraries, I'm sure, when we were actually on campus, and we noticed people praying on the gross carpet all the time. So that's one of the projects we're working on. We don't have spaces like that. That's what I was gonna write. What about the rest of you?
I don't see, what I see is a lot of reading lists.
And
that question
okay.
about, so the Q&A question about where in libraries are you seeing the best response to police brutality and anti-Black racism? And I don't
see that question.
Oh, it's inside the Q&A.
There's two, there's Q&A and there's chat.
It's in Q&A.
Yeah.
And I only see two. Okay, I don't see that.
The idea about this list of non-specific activism about BIPOC in libraries feels especially true now in the wake of the most recent BLM movements. Where in libraries are you seeing the best response to police brutality and anti-Black racism? Do good supportive spaces exist for intersectional feminist, womanist activism in libraries?
That's the question I was trying to answer, and from my perspective, no.
Yeah, I haven't. I've seen a number of letters saying that there is support, and I've also seen a lot of criticism about task force and various committees that are being set up, not always having like the type of institutional power, like maybe there's no Black people on it, maybe there's no people of color, maybe there's too many people of color, and so it's like people of color are burdened to come up with answers to questions that they never, or problems they never created in the first place.
I mean, it's tough, right? Like, what would be the material change you could make? And I think, a reading list feels sort of natural because we work in the library. I think this is a place also where intersectional approach that includes a class analysis is really critical, right? It's the end of the fiscal year while we're talking, and I don't know about you all, but I'm waiting to see what comes from our city and state budgets and how they're going to cut low-wage workers at my library system. And because of the ways that class and race are intertwined in this country, the people making the lowest wages in our library are more likely to be Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so any sort of reading list that doesn't come with a staunch resistance to an organized resistance to those sorts of cuts from the bottom, I think can't begin to address the problem.
I think reading lists are good.
I like a reading list.
But you have to be careful in what you are reading and who is discussing. And when you're talking about things like race and intersectionality, the examples that I've seen have been the people of color will read this book and discuss it amongst themselves, and then the white people will read the same book and discuss it amongst themselves. Because depending on what you're reading, it could be triggering, and it could make the matter worse. So I would be really careful with reading lists on these types of issues.
I agree with that, Teresa. And I think there's also this assumption that if I think racism is bad, that equips me to discuss racism, right? That there isn't a depth of analysis that you have to have to be able to address these problems.
I don't think there's even a baseline level of knowledge. I mean,
Oh yeah.
I've been Black for almost 54 years. And everything that I've learned and experienced up until this point in this Black body is what I, you know, bring to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody does not have that deftness and or even have these conversations. These are hard conversations for folks who thought they were
Absolutely.
okay.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, there's this the ALA information literacy list. I think it's info, and someone put they sent out a message, and the message basically was the headline or the subject was news literacy for white people in virtual protest spaces. Who just, was that you, Sherry?
Yes.
and I kind of just started going through the answers, and some people just responded to them directly about, oh, this resource, or here's this, but then some, and I'm assuming they're white folks, started to question, why are these lists just for us? And I kind of waited, and then a person who I think is white, I think he said he was white, he responded, why? And then I responded to that, and I had like a list of things I went through. It's like, we don't need, people of color don't need resources, we live it, we don't need to read it. And then, you know, I talked a little bit about if you are shocked and outraged by the very public murder of George Floyd, but have had no idea that there are hundreds of other Black men and women, you know, you might need your own separate resources. So people need to think about their positionality. If you've ever said or agreed with or stayed silent when you or someone said they should have complied with the police orders or they still be alive, you might need your own separate white resources. And if your response to Black Lives Matter is all lives matter or blue lives matter, same difference. So if you believe Colin Kaepernick was disrespecting the flag, or or the men and women in armed service, I mean, these are all the reasons, things we hear from our friends and colleagues all the time that they think are perfectly not innocuous, you know, perfectly not even an issue, but they're huge issues, and they signal quite a bit, just in the way people think and the way they parrot stuff back. I hear people at these protests for the president repeating verbatim things that he said, even though it makes no sense that you're defending being out in a pandemic without a mask, and you know, so yeah, that's just like
A question from Marlon Thomas in the Q&A, and I think this is like sort of the same question, but it's the only question that we should be asking. How do we go beyond reading lists, and what can we do to dismantle oppression? I think like that's, I don't know.
Yeah, one of the
Dalena,
questions.
Do you have an answer to that question?
What did you say?
The second
question about the reading list.
Yeah,
Yes.
What can we do to dismantle oppression? I'm waiting for someone to have the answer. Maybe it's you.
Well, and hey guys, there's also a question from Betty Turok over in the chat that relates to this about, I think that one of the most urgent issues for activists, and I have to squint to see it, activist librarianship, and I'm going to cut it short. Even as the demographic ballasts are shifting in our country, the library profession remains predominantly white. Tracy Hall has indicated that she will work to increase women of color in our profession through an increase of funding from the Spectrum Scholarship Initiative. Do you think that is something that this task force could support? So do those things link up in some way? You know, is that the part of the best work that we could do, is to change the face of the profession?
I would say that that's like an eighth of it, maybe. Because I mean, but we can see by Clarence Thomas and Van Jones and Candace Owens and what, you know, just because you have someone, right? Just because someone is African American, and even, what is that guy? I'm so sorry to have to say this, but they call him Talcum X. What is his name?
Sean King.
Yeah, Sean King.
Oh.
Yeah.
So people,
Are you kidding me? They call him that?
Oh, they have so many names. They have a whole long, it's so hilarious. Check Black Twitter, it's hilarious.
Yeah,
so
Black
anyway,
Twitter is good for that.
I think what really needs to do is we have to dismantle white supremacy, right? We have to dismantle that lens that we use to look at and to value collections that we're building and that we're using to value ourselves as professionals and people that we're hiring. I think that's very important. The Spectrum Scholarship, I think, is very important. there also needs to be more done in terms of hiring people of color in full-time library jobs with pay, and supporting those people in dealing with some of the issues that that Teresa was mentioning. Is a lot of ignorance and lack of empathy around what it's like to be a Black person or a Latino person or a Native person or a transgender person in the United States. It's very frightening and it's very violent, and we're used to it, but we shouldn't be used to it. We shouldn't have to be used to it. And I think ALA really needs to put some teeth behind that, that kind of work of dismantling that white supremacy.
I mean, I think if the Spectrum Initiative and those things, I think they make a difference. But if you'll remember in my talk, I noted like we've gotten so far to the left in this profession in describing what diversity is, that what we end up with is a group of people who may or may not be white lesbians. I mean, that's because that's a lot of times that's how diversity shows up, you know? And so I don't know if it can just be the scholarship programs. There has to be something in library schools that there's nothing that I'm aware of in library school to prepare librarians of color or white librarians for what the real world is like and for what it's going to be like to work in these environments. I mean, we're all at home now, but we work very closely and long hours with white folks all day long in these organizations. I think for the Maryland question, how do libraries go beyond reading lists? I don't think it's a library thing. I think it's a people thing. People can read, you know, but people have to make good choices. Someone asked in the last session, and I actually, you know, responded to the question this morning, what could he as a white cis male do to support someone like me? And, you know, I don't even know if I've given that much thought, but I thought about it and I wrote back and I said that, what have you done for the people of color in your life lately? Like, have you considered expanding your circle? Have you talked to them? Have you done the work? Have you read, you know, got a hold of all the books that are being purchased up, you know, all over the world about racism in America? You have to do the work, and then you have to expand your circle, but you cannot expect the people of color in your life to educate you. That's not fair. That's unpaid labor.
I also feel like we're often talking about this as if the only people in our libraries are MLS degreed librarians, right? And that is an extremely white layer, but I don't know that extends to our pages and our paraprofessionals and whatever language we use to talk about the people who get paid systematically a tiny fraction of what even the person who goes through the Spectrum Scholarship makes, right? Like, I think a lot of this equity has to start within our own organizations, and at least in New York City, every library I've ever worked in, the people making the call are white up here, and the people who are subject to that are often in New York City, Black people, Latino people. I mean, it's like
a classic faculty versus staff divide. We have a huge faculty versus staff divide in this country. We have staff working in librarian positions, doing librarian things, but not getting paid for it. And when they have the MLSs, and so when you start to you have to look at all of those inequities. I agree, Emily. Yeah,
I think there's a question. There was a question about what is a challenge to activism. And I was thinking this, but someone in the comments mentioned, sorry to shout you out, A.L. Carson. But when someone says that the library needs to be welcoming to people of all political beliefs, they always mean white supremacists or unreflectively racist. And they most always are responding to a suggestion that the library establish actively supportive policies. So I think one of the biggest challenges is this tendency we want to say, okay, both sides have a valid point, and we need to make it very clear that both sides do not have a valid point. And I think that's part of dismantling white supremacy, is to say that this viewpoint that people of color and women and poor people need to be pushed out of society in various ways has a leg to stand on. Like, we really need to understand that it does not have a leg to stand on. and kind of like, that's, you know, we're not going to support that as institutions.
Hey, I'm conscious of the time, but I would be interested in your thoughts on Becca Bastron's point in the chat that the MLS is a barrier to entry for the profession. Because I think we can think of it as like a barrier because it's costly, right? And it takes time, but it also seems like a ladder. And like, I wonder if there's some mechanism by which getting rid of the MLS automatically diversifies the profession. It doesn't seem to me that it would do anything like that. And so I've been wondering how to think about that.
Yeah, I think it would deprofessionalize the profession. I think that's what the MLS has been about, is making sure that, you know, librarians were treated as professionals and given a certain amount of control over our field and how we want it to grow. That being said, maybe that's an opportunity for ALA and similar groups to step up and reduce the cost of getting an MLIS as a barrier to entering the field. You know, if people knew that they could support themselves while going through school or what have you, I'm sure an MLS wouldn't be such a barrier.
Well,
I don't think that the MLS is the barrier. Someone mentioned, I think it was Celia, she says, even if we get rid of the requirements, we also have to confront the fact that the people making hiring decisions, filling librarian positions are largely white. True. It's the people who are making these decisions. We can deprofessionalize, we can get through the MLS, rid of it, we could do whatever. You know, it's the people, if they're gonna still hire all white people, and you know, where I am, we just basically hire white women. We usually bring in at least one person of color for most of our searches, but we will continuously handle the hire the white women. That's what we do. So, I mean, it can be a barrier for some people, but if we recalled a while back, Stanley Wilder, he did all of that research looking at the profession, and he said that he actually predicted that we would be hiring more people with skills, different sets of skills than just for reference librarian, instruction, acquisitions, collections. And those people are out there and they're creative and they don't have MLSs, and we're not hiring them because they're not librarians. Because we can't think beyond, we can't think that our profession has evolved and that we need people with other types of skills, because library school is not teaching us enough anyway. And so,
I wonder if those, sorry, Teresa.
No, you're good, go ahead.
Like when you hire those people with a different sort of set of skills, like how often are they going to be white people? You know, like there isn't anything automatic about it unless you make a concerted effort.
Because we're going to hire somebody that we need for data. We're going to hire somebody for you know, something else, 3D printing something. And those are going to be white folks who have had those experiences.
Yeah, and there's also this question of like reverse racism. I know it's fiction, I know it doesn't exist, but it's very challenging to talk about race when you're on hiring committees, because it's considered, you know, discriminatory. But I think it's a valuable conversation to say, okay, look, we have 50 applications for this job, this number of qualified people are this race. You know, let's think about that when we're bringing people on campus, and maybe it shakes out that, you know, we choose not to. But I think if we're conscious of it, and conscious of that lens in which the job description gets written and where it gets posted and everything else, then we can really start to say, okay, how can we make this better when we're hiring?
Yeah, I've been to so many of those like trainings where they teach you how to not be racist in your hiring process, but really it's about how to not get caught by the law when you're racist in your hiring practices. It's just it's compliance at its most base and disgusting.
But it's also, you know, what we're told, or what a number of us have been told at my institution, is that when you voice a concern about something racial that someone has said in a search committee, that the determination has always been, oh, it does not reach the level of a hostile work environment. But it happened 2 weeks ago, and I'm in the same environment I was 2 weeks. I'm just saying, you know, and so that's the fight there with not even getting it out of the library building. It didn't even leave the building. It just stopped right there. And so it's the people who are standing in the way of progress. If we can get ourselves out of our own way, then maybe we can make some progress for, you know, towards truly diversifying this profession.
I like that. Get out of our own way.
We want to take this last question and then.
But are we going to take any of these? Will we be taking all of the rest of this chat, and will we have an opportunity to respond to those?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask Monica.
Yeah. Okay.
Our ALA liaison. Monica, will we have the opportunity to kind of add answers later?
What do you like to do? Send a, I'll be able to download the chat, I'm pretty sure. So maybe send you guys the questions, send the panelists the questions, and then you can do some answering. Would you like to do a follow-up? What would you like to do?
Well, how would we get them to the actual people who are here?
I'm pretty sure that we can send a email follow-up with everyone.
Okay.
I just have to check on it.
It says that it'll be on the ALA YouTube page. Can we just like post the question
there?
Yeah, we can just make comments there.
Yeah, we'll be putting this on the ALA YouTube page.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Are libraries really dependent on social media platforms that have no interest in fact checking?
Wait, what?
I'm sorry, the question, how do we
Oh, we're
stop
just taking a look at the
libraries-
open Q&A.
Oh, okay,
Oh.
okay.
I'm sorry, yes, I'm looking back at the open Q&A. Yeah, how do we stop libraries' dependence on social media platforms that have no
Is there an
interest?
example? Is there an example of that? Arzu Mohseni? Was there something specific? I don't. Okay.
Yeah, I think we don't quite get the context of that question.
Right.
So I'll say something about that in the Q&A. Any thoughts from either of you on Marlon Thomas's last question?
Is it in the chat or the?
Yeah, it's in the Q&A.
Oh.
How about developing more people of color and other minority groups who work as staff at HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and tribal colleges?
I mean, you're going to run into the same thing if we're requiring MLSs. Like, I know that the master's degree is a terminal degree. So for us, at least here, that is what you have to have in order to have that rank or to have that position. And so I don't know what it looks like at other organizations, but there is a definite divide between this category and then a staff category, you know, faculty or librarian staff.
Also,
so depending on how they can actually, if they can actually do that, I don't know.
Does any institution have the ability to, within their library or any other part of the organization, the ability to actually, so say a staff person goes to school, and there are institutions that will support education, because I've looked into that for my own institution about developing a tuition program for staff who want to seek higher degrees. But then they get an MLS. I have 2 people right now on the staff who have an MLS, but they're in a staff position. And I don't have the ability to create a librarian position for them. They're obviously qualified for it. And so does any institution, is there any model for that? Does anybody have a way that we could not only hire people, grow them into the MLIS position, and then make that position for them so they aren't on the job market?
yeah.
But does that exist anywhere?
Well,
I mean, we could make it exist. We could just decide, right?
Yeah.
And work to make it happen where we are.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at this, how to develop more people of color and other minority groups, blah, blah, blah. I think it's important to understand that people work at HBCUs and Hispanic serving institutions because they want to work with people who have a shared experience and shared things like that. The goal isn't necessarily to kind of spread thin communities across the MLS field. So yeah, like we can't poach HBCUs for staff because, you know, some place in Iowa wants to have a Black, like that's not cool.
So, well, Sherry, you know, we had that problem here, actually. A number of years ago, I guess whenever the Emporia, Kansas online program came on board, a lot of folks, staff, were encouraged to get their MLSs. Now, what happens in these situations is you can encourage someone, but then they're going to expect to be able to, you know, get a job. And and over the years, a number of them have applied for positions. That's the other thing. We don't create entry-level positions in libraries. It's always, you know, all of the positions are a coordinator or whatever. These people that we are encouraging to get these degrees will never get jobs in our library unless there's something else going on, which has happened where I've been anyway. So what you could do is, you know, you always have to tell these folks that you can't move up generally until you move out. And that if you're gonna get this degree, you're gonna invest in it, then you can't sit here and wait for us to give you a job. You know how we do. You need to encourage them to go out and put themselves out there and to find a job in their profession. And that's difficult for people of color because a lot of times we're living, our families are everything and no one wants to move, so.
Yeah, I'm not gonna up and move yeah, that's untenable for people who have like complicated lives. I do think like our organizations could do that. Like we could make a choice as an organization to fund the degrees of staff of color and promote them upon the completion of the MLS, right? Like, is there a model for that? No, but like we could make that happen and it would be hard and maybe we're not in charge, but we could organize and get enough of us to make that kind of a demand.
Because there's certainly the opportunity will be made to hire a trailing spouse for an important faculty appointment.
For sure, yeah, no problem. My brother just got hired like that. Anyway, but I'm not going to air my family's dirty laundry. It's 4:40 and I have to hit another meeting. So how can we?
I don't even know how much time we had.
I think we're in the negative 10 minutes, but
that's
Monica has to cut us off because I think we'll go as long as we want to.
I think we could talk for a very long time.
Well, we're losing folks because we're down about 50 folks, so we are losing people.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. You know, it's been so great to get to know both of your work, Dalena and Teresa, a little better, and I appreciate the conversation.
It's been great, and thank you all so much, and thanks to Emily and Dalena and Teresa and Monica today and Brianna previously and April Shepard, who is out there maybe still for creating the program. And one of the things that we haven't done is we haven't figured out where Feminist Task Force is going next. And so I think that's the continuation of this conversation, is to mine these comments and questions. And I'm so excited that, you know, 200 people were here at one point. That's, you know, 200 times more people than we've had at a Feminist Task Force meeting at the last ALA conference. So this is very exciting. And so look for another email from me. I think that's what I'm saying.
Okay. And then all of the panelists they'll get another email maybe from Emily or Monica with our answers. Okay.
Yeah.
It's been great working with you ladies. Thank you so much.
Oh, bye-bye everybody. Have a great
weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.